everybody. Welcome to the Always Hope podcast, the show that provides solutions to a better life that are anchored in faith and science. My name is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and happy that you're joining me for another amazing episode today. Well, have you ever thought about feminism and its relationship to Catholicism? That seems like a weird thing, doesn't it? We often think that those two are diametrically opposed to one another. But part of what I enjoy about our faith is that it's a rather reasonable faith. And if you've ever wondered what Catholicism actually teaches about feminism, well then this episode is the one for you. Often we tend to see these as poles against each other, but what we see is that our faith always is seeking dialogue and is always trying to interact with the world and try to find what's good and to be able to sift out what's bad. So today I sit down with Dr. Kevin Stuart to discuss the creation of a new Catholic Women's and Gender Studies program, that's not an oxymoron, at the University of St. Thomas. We dive into the tension between traditional Catholic views and secular views on gender studies. Dr. Stuart also explains the goals of the program, which integrate faith, scientific literature, and a Catholic perspective on feminism, gender, and the role of women in society. Rather than outright rejecting feminism, they are engaging in intellectual dialogue with its leading theorists. And we further discuss in this episode why this program exists, how to appropriately use the term gender, how technology has changed the landscape for male and female relationships, and what can we do to continue pushing against a utilitarian and a transactional view of sexuality. If you enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, offer a comment on Apple Podcasts. Every little bit helps. Leave a comment on YouTube, depending on how you are receiving this show. Every little bit absolutely helps to give some traction and to help others know about the good work that we're doing here with the Always Hope podcast. So many blessings to you all. Let's get into this conversation with Dr. Kevin Stuart. Dr. Kevin Stuart, welcome to the Always Hope podcast. How are you doing today?
Glad to be here. Thank you. Doing well.
Yeah, well, grateful to have you come on the show to talk about this new Catholic Women's and Gender Study program that you guys are beginning or have begun at the University of St. Thomas. So if we could just jump right into it, why start a Catholic women's studies program? I mean, generally women's studies programs are viewed as the antithesis of Catholicism, the bane of the existence for most conservative Catholics. Why step into that arena and say, no, we're going to give a Catholic voice to these issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And in fact, part of the answer is in the setup of the question. Yeah. You know, I'm a fan of Calvin Coolidge type wisdom that if you see 10 tires rolling down a hill, 9 of them are going to roll into the ditch all by themselves. What you have to figure out is what's the one that's not, and it's going to create a problem that you then have to go and solve. Well, precisely as you set it up and I say typical, maybe what I should say is every other women's and gender studies
every other.
program
That's exactly right. Yes, every other.
Every other women's and gender studies program out there, they are not beginning from the real foundation of who and what we are as human persons. And so that problem was not going away. That problem was creating bigger problems. And so it's time, in the church, we sometimes move a little slowly, but we have a lot to bring to the table when we get there. Mm-hmm. And I think this issue is a great example of that. The church has a lot to contribute to a conversation about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, in the context of what it means to be a human person made in the image and likeness of God.
Well, how does this program differ from something like the John Paul II Institute for Family and Studies?
Yeah, so this program is different in a few ways. The first is we really are going after, we will certainly incorporate issues and we will have collegial relationships and maybe even share scholars with some similarly situated programs. But we really are going right at the issues of feminism. Mm-hmm. Is there such a thing as Catholic feminism? We're going right at the issues such as sexuality and gender. There is no wire so hot we won't touch it, and that may turn out to be, we may get shocked, but we're gonna give it a good run. And so I think one of my commitments as a person, as a scholar, one of the things that really drives me is that all truth is God's truth. that we have nothing to fear from science done well. We have nothing to fear from philosophy done well. We have a tremendous amount to be worried about from either of those things done poorly. And so what we're stepping in to do is to bring the treasures of the church. There are, if you go to a typical women's and gender studies program, the earliest authors you will treat will be 19th century. That'll be the ancient stuff.
Right.
Well, we've got almost 2,000 years of church thinking to go before that. Another 1,000 years with the Old Testament, right? And half a millennium more with ancient Greek thought, that the church has synthesized all of these into our understanding. It's incorporated all of these into a whole understanding of male and female. He created them.
Yes. Preach it, Kevin. I mean, I'm with you. There's something, I've said this on the show many times, but my spiritual director from college would always say, the truth is the truth is the truth is the truth. And preaching exactly to what you said. And that's what we've tried to do with this program is being able to offer truth that's coming from the scientific literature, from our faith, and being able to find those points of integration, which is really the beauty of what makes us Catholic, and being able to look at the whole and to have a particular lens that we can say, okay, this is good, this is not good. And we shouldn't just be reactionary to everything that's happening within the world. Because as I've heard say also, the opposite of crazy is crazy. If we just go from one extreme to the other, then we're missing the point of what it means to be an evangelist, of what it means to be a witness, of what it means to actually be engaging with the world as it exists. And so if we start there, then like, how does Catholicism, okay, because the term Catholic feminism, I've interviewed many theologians and other individuals and other women specifically who have kind of preached this notion of a Catholic feminism. For those who feel that phraseology kind of grates in the ears or feels a little bit too much of an oxymoron, how can we assuage that a little bit? Like, how does the church's teaching help us to understand even the modern notions of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be in relationship with men?
Yeah. So the first thing I would tell those folks, some of whom are our donors, by the way, is that
how did you convince them? I mean, that's a great question. How did you convince? Give us money. I promise. We're not communists. We're not socialists.
Yeah. So there are two ways to go here, right? One is to be dismissive about it, and I think that's the wrong way to go. Another is to acknowledge that people who have those worries have legitimate reasons for having those worries.
That's right.
Right? There is such a thing as ceding too much ground. There are language uses that sort of bracket out the truth, that actually occlude more than they disclose and make it harder to get to what's really true. And so I don't discount any of that or dismiss any of that. I in fact agree with some of that, and think that at the practical level, the right way to start bending things back toward the truth is to get off the bench and get in the game. And that means starting where the conversation is. And so it's within the context of a classroom where we have a crucifix on the wall, where we say a prayer at the beginning of class. Those are the best places. Those are the places where the terms themselves are going to be up for discussion and disagreement. It's in a Catholic classroom where it won't simply be assumed that all the fundamental claims of 19th and 20th century feminism are true, but where we will actually interrogate, does the word gender, for example, hide more from us? Does it deceive us more than it reveals the truth to us? And if it can reveal the truth, what truth can it reveal, and what is the proper way to understand it? So I don't look down on any of those who are worried. I in fact agree with a lot of those who are worried about some of this, but think that the right approach to battling the exact problems that they're worried about is to get in there and do it. At the end of the day, this is one of the things that motivates the creation of the program, is that at the end of the day, we can't beat something with nothing. We've got to get in there and offer the alternative. And I think if we put if we put Judith Butler and then St. Edith Stein, right, in the same conversation, the Catholic resources are going to show themselves to be superior sources of wisdom and truth. And they will have a very practical guidance for us. That's really the other, you asked about the nature of the program and specifically how it's different from others. And that comes out here too, where we are geared fundamentally toward starting from a very deep, rich, philosophical, theological beginning point, but actually ending at a very practical point of application, so that the final courses, the final classes that people take are heavily geared toward practical application across a number of fields where these issues are prominent. Okay. So medical issues and medical ethics, law, education, a variety of professions like that where these issues are profoundly important. And then also to get really into the practical elements there.
Well, you answered another question that I had, which is just what would be the outcome of the students? And you're already given it, which is that it can be applied in a lot of different outcomes. Because I imagine somebody who graduates from this program can't just go teach in another women's and gender studies program because they're not going to be able to, that language is going to be different. But when you spoke about that comparison between Judith Butler, for example, and Edith Stein, I had on my podcast a couple of years ago, a moral theologian by the name of Dr. Sarah Denny. Have you met her yet? She's in New Orleans. Have you interacted with Sarah at all?
I have not, but I would eagerly invite it. I'd
Sarah's great. And I think Sarah actually, I'm going to put a plug for Sarah right now, or Dr. Denny on your list, because the conversation I had with her, she wrote her dissertation on comparing the notion of freedom from Margaret Sanger's understanding of freedom to John Paul II's understanding of freedom. And so the whole conversation that we had on the podcast was exactly about her dissertation thesis. And she's awesome. And it was really incredible, just as she talked about really reading all the letters of Margaret Sanger and understanding her to some degree, even personal letters and things of that nature, but being able to say, I know what you're talking about with freedom, but then here's John Paul II's understanding of freedom and how much it's a better version of the term. It's a fuller version of the term. And so if she's somebody, I strongly encourage you to connect with her. I'm making a plug here on the podcast for other people. This is how we do this, but she's excellent. But if maybe let's go back to this question that you said, all right, getting into the weeds of it, the term gender, why don't we start there? Okay. Is that a term that is sufficient? I mean, is it something that works? Because I've heard a lot of conflict between us. I've heard obviously sex referring to biological, gender maybe being more from a cultural perspective. Somebody like Jordan Peterson, for example, is not a fan of the term gender and has spoken publicly like we just need to abolish the term because it just makes things too confusing and leaves things too open-ended. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think so. Here's where I think the real fight is. I think sex is biological. And it's true that there are cultural components to gender. So the term, when it's used properly, is meant to pick out something that is not necessarily biological. And yet the complicating factor is, of course, these are interlocked and overlapping, right? There are portions of what we understand to be gender. It is not, it is not merely biological. That women tend to have longer hair, right? Hairstyles, right. And men tend to have shorter hair, right? That is not biologically determined.
Right, that's right.
And yet it's not irrelevant, and it's not completely separate from sex. And there are a variety. That's a trivial cultural element, but there are a lot of things. The way that mothers approach rearing children is different from the way fathers do it. These roles are gendered, which is not to say that we can look at any particular chromosome and see, oh, there's the mothering chromosome, right? But these are practices which are outworkings of, related to, even if not guaranteed by biology. And so they're related. They're not strictly and exclusively biological, but they are related. And we need some term, it seems to me, to capture those phenomena, which are tightly related, more or less tightly related, right? Some very tightly related to biology, some a little looser, like whether you wear pants or skirts, right? Ask an 18th century Scotsman, you might get a different answer from a 20th century American.
That's right.
Right. So some are looser, some are merely fashion, some are merely cultural. I think the mistake that you see in something like Judith Butler, since her name has come up, is to assume or to assert that all forms of gender behavior are like that. They are merely fashion. They are merely performative. They are merely cultural. I think it's that kind of assumption or assertion that the Catholic tradition is going to be able to really challenge. And I think it's going to be great because that kind of Butlerian way of thinking is actually very flat, right? It makes everything merely cultural. Whereas the Catholic understanding of our embodiedness is much richer, much deeper, and I think much better suited to the lives that we live. I mean, the ultimate goal here is flourishing, and ultimate goals are flourishing and holiness. And I think a richer Catholic understanding of our maleness and masculinity, our femaleness and femininity, aid both our flourishing in this life and our holiness for the next one.
Another theologian here I'm going to ask if you know. Have you met Dr. Jennifer Morel in Baton Rouge? She teaches at Franciscan University there in Baton Rouge. It's okay. Just another friend, guest that I've had on the podcast who is very much in this realm of these studies. We Jennifer and I, we met when we were both professors at Notre Dame Seminary, and she was teaching in moral theology. I was the director of counseling services for the seminary. And Jennifer did this during her sabbatical. She did this worldwide study of looking at these notions of sex and gender and understanding, okay, like if the church teaches this, it's like that's what it means to be a woman and a man, understanding that. But there is the prism of culture that allows for an expression of these truths, of these realities. How do we explore that? And so she went to, I think she explored like 16 different cultures throughout the world. It was like South Louisiana, tribes in Montana, Mexico. She went to Vietnam. She went to Africa. She went to Europe. I mean, it's like a worldwide study that she did. And looking at how Catholics in these particular areas took these truths of what the church proclaims and how they filtered it through their perspective of being from the respective kind of culture that they're from. And she's the one who really kind of helped me to see exactly what you just said, which is that we recognize that there's something at a chromosomal level that is the difference between us. And we get to the extreme in our world right now is that we say, well, even biology itself, it doesn't even matter. It's just a made up entity, which is crazy, but that's the world that we live in, you know? And so everything associated with these questions of masculinity and femininity are entirely cultural. The whole thing is cultural. And with that, even oppressive, there's even some malintent as to why things are the way that they are, the patriarchy that's trying to oppress women and to keep them in a certain box, and that type of language that emerges. And we recognize that that's too much of an extreme on that side. But then we've also seen now this kind of hyper reaction from the conservative side, which is reasserting that everything is almost predeterministic, that there are these kind of rules or laws, even misappropriating like Thomas Aquinas or things, you know, where it's like, it's natural. I've heard stuff like this, you know, where natural law dictates that a woman should always be under a man, be it her father or being, you know, her husband. And it's unnatural for her to kind of be on her own type of thing. And like you hear stuff like that coming from the hard kind of conservative circles of things. And it's like, well, that doesn't sound right either, you know? And so like, help me understand that side of it, I guess, you know, like how do we respond to kind of this hyper conservative kind of critique that's emerging?
Yeah, so I think there are several dimensions working at once.
Let's go.
Right? So on the one hand, you're exactly right to describe the fact that there's one approach is nothing is biological. It's all imposed and culturally performative. And that's one kind of mistake. And it's a mistake that obviously leads people to mutilate their bodies in an attempt to conform
That's right.
their biology to their psychology, rather than the other way around.
That's right.
Right. So it doesn't give biology its due.
And it's completely, I'm gonna stop you there, I'm sorry to interrupt you. And it's also completely reductionistic in the sense that, like, as if that is the only thing, the only real difference. Just our sexual organs is the only difference, biologically speaking, between men and women. Forget differences in brain structure, forget differences in olfactory structures, to forget differences in vision, forget differences in hearing, forget differences in muscle to fat ratio, bone density. I mean, all the other strictly biological things that make up differences between men and women beyond just the sexual organs and its appearance. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
So in a way, it's selling each sex short, because it fails to fully appreciate how we were fearfully and wonderfully made, and the differences between us, and the amazing ways that those differences go together for the sake of human flourishing.
That's right.
So that's one particular error. The other error, as you alluded to, is to go hard in the other direction, that it's all really biological, that it's all really determined, or it's all determined in the same way that biology is determined, right? There's a bright line, you're male or female, and if you're male, here are all the things, both physical, emotional, psychological, and cultural, they all are automatically there and only there. And if you're a woman, here are all the things that are physical, emotional, psychological, and cultural, and they're all automatically there, and nary the twain shall meet. Well, then you come to a household like my own, where my wife is a wonderful mother and very feminine and beautiful, and has a PhD, and I'm the cook in the house, because I'm a better cook. So it's a better division of labor. Know that? Does she agree with that statement? We're not going to get you in trouble. We're not going to get you in trouble by making that comment, are you? I don't want you sleeping on the couch tonight, all right, Kevin? I am like. She's a great cook, but I love to cook. It's my it's a hobby. I wear the results of it every day, right? But these, one of the things that helps in a situation like this is coming from a background of social science, where we're almost always dealing with, on the whole and for the most part, sorts of arguments where we see strong tendencies in data, but there are always exceptions, right? And why are there exceptions? Well, because of what Aquinas would call circumstance, right? There are for every decision, there are matters of principle outside of which we can't deviate, and on which we need to be clear about what the principled lines are. But within those principal lines, there are often lots of circumstances contributing to a prudential decision as to what the best route forward is. And so I think any good program where you're being reflective about men and women is going to operate in a mode of identifying what are those principal differences, right? And in this case, a lot of those are going to be biology, which will then form a kind of boundary condition. And then what are the tendencies within those that are normative, where we go along, where we're working with nature? Where are those where we're fighting nature? Where are those where that are sort of neutral, right? I mean, it's sort of neutral culturally as to whether men wear pants or not. But it is going to tend to be the case that women are more nurturing for children, and men are more roughhousing in their play with children. That does not mean it will be the case every time. But there are both biological components and cultural components as to why we tend to see that. And I think one of the geniuses of a Catholic standpoint, a Catholic approach to all of this, is the sort of discernment, the sort of quiescence in the face of the truth, to be able to handle all of this complexity without freaking out in one direction or another. Because we know that this is all God's creation, and these are all God's children. And so all of this fits together, even if it's not obvious to us, maybe from the get-go, how it is that the truths of Scripture and the truths of church teaching and the truths of even some contemporary science, even if it's not always obvious right from the jump, how all those things fit together, if we just think carefully and clearly about them and dispassionately and discuss and disagree civilly, we will, it is my confidence, it is the guarantee of our faith that we will get to a point where we see them all fitting together.
So would you let your boys wear pink?
Yes, I mean, I'm a Southerner, so we are okay. As you know, boys, it's often the case that they do, and actually that's a great example. So if people can do a Google search on this, in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, red and pink were the color for boys, and it did an about face in the 20th century. But how hung up we should be on a tradition that's that new is an open question.
Yeah.
Now, if my boys came and wanted piercings and makeup and other stuff, then we're going to have a conversation about cultural roles and why that's not appropriate.
Yeah, because
what signals they're sending to other people when they do that.
Well, that's what's even hard even about the pink question now, because it's like, well, does it signal something? Is it like a stand, like, oh, you're being forward and progressive because you're allowing your boys to wear pink because it's been viewed in these kind of stereotypes. This is the problem with the transgender movement, is that in many ways it's actually reinforced the stereotypes that it's trying to break free from. Because it says that if you're a boy who likes to wear pink, well, then that means something, that there's something. Or if you're a girl that likes to wear blue, well, then, there's something that could mean more. Like my wife was sort of a tomboy growing up, and she talks about that. And I mean, I wonder what that would have looked like, in today's day and age, where it's all kind of being pushed in this direction. It's like, if this happens, then this happens. And what you're saying is beautiful, in the notion that pink, okay, maybe not so much, but there is a limit here where we start talking about maybe earrings or certain piercings or wearing dresses or things. It's like, okay, there comes a point where it's like, okay, now we're definitely signaling something, but where can we have a conversation about that, and where can we kind of settle on the middle ground with that?
Yeah, I think some part of it is we need to recognize what the point and purpose of social norms and habits and these sort of institutions is. And it's and the point and purpose is often to make social life together easier for each other. Right. There's an extent to which this is one of the modern problems, right? Is we tend to see rules and limitations as limits on our freedom, instead of seeing them as avenues for expression of our freedom, and ways that we get to the good. So we try to teach our boys good manners. And I think being a Southerner, one of the things that I'm very keenly aware of in contemporary society is that these old school manners are often thought of as a straitjacket on your expression. But in a way, I think that completely misunderstands them. When you have manners that you share with other people, then everybody knows how the other people are going to behave. And so we all sort of know what's coming, even if something unexpected happens. When we go to someone's house for dinner, we sort of know the order of eating, right? We know the pie isn't going to come first.
It should, though.
We know
which come first. I'm fine for breaking that cultural mold.
we know sort of which fork to use. We know that the piece of cloth that's set near our plate, we know what it's for. We don't put it on our head. Right? We don't attempt to wear it as a cape. We know that it goes in our lap. We know where it goes when we need to get up and go to the restroom during the meal, right? So we develop these sort of ways, and those all actually help make us more comfortable in these situations. And so cultural norms are, in a way, not just they do function as signaling devices to other people, but they also help us feel comfortable in our social world, so that we feel more at home in ourselves. The fundamental experience, this gets us really into the gender dysphoria area, because the fundamental experience that is not to be dismissed of a patient suffering gender dysphoria is they feel so uncomfortable in the world that they feel alienated from their own body. And that would be profoundly distressing to anyone, not to feel at home even in your own body. And this cries out for both a therapeutic approach, and especially a theologically grounded therapeutic approach, to help them see that God made them the way they are, and in the body that they have, and that nothing is wrong with that. It was not a mistake. They are not a mistake. They are a child of God, made in His image and likeness.
There are many body dysmorphia conditions that are discussed in the DSM. We could talk about anorexia, for example, where somebody thinks that they're overweight, but they're 90 pounds. Somebody who feels that their arm has been cut off, they've lost connection with their arm, but the arm is still there physically, and so on and so forth. And the normal course of treatment in those circumstances is to help the person get the internal experience to then match the external experience. You would never tell an anorexic, yeah, no, you are in fact actually fat. Like, why don't you just keep trying to lose weight till you get to that point that you want to get to? Or, yeah, no, you're actually right that you don't have that arm there. So why don't we go and just cut that off and let the external then match the internal? We would never do that as a normal course of treatment in those circumstances. But when it comes to this issue with regards to gender dysphoria, we've accepted that as the normal course of treatment, rather than giving space for people to begin asking those questions and saying, well, what is in fact contributing to this disconnect that I have? Because we can agree, and we should absolutely not be dismissive, as you said, about people's real experiences within this. But to give them space to be able to say, okay, well, why is the internal not matching the external? And what can we do to help bring about some greater synergy within that, without having to resort towards mutilation of the body to get it to match whatever's happening interiorly? It could be that maybe there is a little bit more expression that needs to happen. Maybe a man is a little bit more comfortable with women, or women are a little more comfortable with men, and giving them space to be able to find some nuance so that they can find that place of commonality, that place of freedom within them. And I think that if we can do that more effectively, or encourage that a little bit more effectively, then maybe we can be a little bit more helpful to folks.
Yeah, the data backs that up, and as a Catholic, I should not be surprised by studies that confirm this, but I always am a bit excited when I see things like there was a very good meta-analysis done of interventions for gender dysphoria. And what they showed was that when they compared interventions that paired chemical interventions, so hormone suppression and cross-sex hormones, with surgical procedures and high-quality counseling, the outcomes were not any different from those patients who just received counseling, which is to say that to the extent that there is improvement, all of the improvement is really coming from the counseling. But of course, that should make sense to us, because that's where the problem is, right? The problem is not with the body in these cases. I mean, to push one of your examples even further, if an anorexic patient came to a surgeon and said, I want you to shave down my hip bones so that I look as thin as I want to feel. Right. The surgeon would say no, on pain of malpractice and losing their license, right? A surgeon would say no. But how in principle is that different from the approach that typical medical providers today are not just pursuing, but pressuring parents into and profiting massively from?
Maybe you're listening to this episode and wondering how you can apply these themes in a more practical way into your own life. Let's talk about specifically dating. Let's say that you're a single person and you just got out of a relationship and not quite sure how the other person, how the other sex thinks about dating, or you don't really know what you can do to improve communication in your relationship if you are in a dating relationship right now. Well, I got a wonderful program for you called Dating Well, which goes through all the ins and outs of the modern dating scene to give you a very practical, pragmatic, step-by-step, take you by the hand, walk you through all the stages of the relationship to help you be as prepared and confident for your current relationship or for your next relationship. Listen, we all know that dating is a mess right now. We all know that we're trying to figure this thing out on our own. Well, you don't have to anymore. Check out Dating Well. Head on over to drmariusacasa.com, click on the Dating Well tab, and you'll learn more about this wonderful program that has helped hundreds of people already be able to increase their confidence and their knowledge and their skill set when it comes to dating. So you don't have to do this alone. Happy to provide this resource for you so that you can achieve more confidence when it comes to dating. If we can go back to this question of commonality in manners, and I love that image that you spoke about with regards to going to dinner and you know what a fork is. I think of that great scene, of course, from The Little Mermaid and taking the dinglehopper, and kind of combing her hair type of thing. And everybody's looking at her, it's just something wrong. Well, because she's not used to whatever those cultural norms are. J.K. Rowling, who I know has taken a lot of slack here recently from the liberal side regarding her comments and thoughts related to transgenderism. The first quote that she put out, or tweet that she put out, was something related to how was it? It was an art. She was responding to an article that was referring to women as people who birth children or something like that, birthing persons, as opposed to calling them women. And she sarcastically was like, whoa, there's a term here that I feel like we're missing. She's being sarcastic in that. But J.K. Rowling, being a linguist, being a master of the English language, she understands, this is at least how I'm interpreting her kind of concerns here, and I'd love to get your sense on this, is that if we lose some commonality with words, that we can look at you and say you're a man, and look at me and say I'm a man, or look at this camera and call it a camera, or look at this thing and call it a microphone, that we have to have for us to be able to exist as a society and to have common relationships with one another, that we have to have some agreed upon terms on things. And while, okay, maybe not every microphone is going to look exactly like this, or every camera is going to look exactly like that, or every man's going to look like this, or every man's going to look like that, or whatever it is, at least we can kind of have we need to have some labels on some things that, again, to the point that you're making, are meant to be restrictive, but are in fact actually what helps us to engage in commonality, allow us to even engage in language, in conversation, in community, in communion. And if we abandon those phrases, then we're losing even the capacity to talk to one another.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a huge reason why Christians in general, and especially those of us in higher education, have to step in and reassert the truths, the grounding truths of these language patterns. I mean, in a way, Rowling is brilliant in that moment, because, of course, what it is to be a woman, among other things, biologically, foundationally, is to have one's biology ordered around the nurture and reproduction of the human species. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It tends toward that. Even in instances where things don't, where misfortunes happen, mm-hmm. where things don't work as we wish they would, right? And there are lots of cases of that. Mm-hmm. But what it means fundamentally, biologically, is to have that order, exactly the ordering that she picked out. So in a way, like she's exactly right. We have a word for birthing persons, right? And that word is woman. Mm-hmm. That they are more than that, yep. But that is fundamentally what they are. It's not necessarily who they are, but it is what they are. And we have to come back and reinforce. I joke with people, but it's only half a joke, when I give lectures, that my job today, most of my job today as a social scientist, is to tell you things you already know, but with numbers. And this is an instance where we need to go back to telling one another what we already know, which is what a woman is, what a man is. We need to reassert that. And we shouldn't lose sight of how important that is. I think if we think back, say 10 or 15 years, when the country was engaged in a fight about what marriage is, a lot of people found themselves uncomfortable at whether it's company Christmas parties or neighborhood meetings, because they had never needed an argument up to that point about what marriage was. And all of a sudden, when they needed an argument the most, they didn't have it because we hadn't prepared for that fight. Well, let's not make that mistake again, right? Let's go get armed up for the fight by reminding ourselves of what men and women are, by reminding ourselves of what all the best evidence and arguments are for all of this, and then in charity and with civility, deploying them in a very thoughtful, careful, and strong way.
Do you think that civility is still possible? I mean, I just feel like our political divide has been I don't know. I mean, I know people have said in years past it's been worse than this, but I just feel like we're not even talking the same language anymore. Like we're not even on the same planet anymore. And I have lots of conversations with Catholics on this show who myself included, trying to be a space where we can have dialogue with the other side, so to speak. I hate to use those type of labels, but I think people know what I'm talking about. And I feel like the opportunities for conversation from those who lean differently than us are far and few between. Like even in my programs, like I went to secular counseling programs all the way through. In my master's, when I did my master's from 2004, 2006, thereabouts, it was there, and but at least they allowed conversation related to homosexuality, and I was a Catholic and could speak about my faith and could bring that up, and we would have healthy discourse or debate in the classroom, which I thought was very appropriate, even within kind of a secular counseling program. You fast forward 10 years later, I start my doctorate from 2004, or do my doctorate from 2014 to 2017, excuse me. And I found in those 10 years, in a similar type program, it was a different institution, but a similar program, that it was vastly different, and there was much more antagonism, and that even bringing up areas of disagreement would almost be a cause for me to be kicked out of the program. Now, there were a couple professors, don't get me wrong, who would allow conversation to still happen. Even if they didn't agree with me, they still would open it. But it seemed like there was much more hostility towards people of faith in that. So what do you think about that in terms of just even the ability to have conversation?
I think so. A couple things to say. One is that what you've just outlined is one of our crosses to bear today. One of the things that Scripture promises is that being a follower of Christ is probably not going to make us rich and famous and a comfortable celebrity. That it's going to come with hardship. And we are finding out right now that this is one instance of what hardship looks like in practice, right? Is defending the truth under these kinds of threats and penalties. Another thing to say at a deeper level of what's going on with the problem is that we are no longer friends with one another.
Right.
This is one of the things that my children have taught me. I think I knew it somewhere, but it's really come to the fore because I have to actively have it in mind with my kids, is that I have to earn the right to discipline and correct them. And I earn that right through the relationship I have that right in virtue of being their father, but I continue to earn that right precisely by being their father, by having a loving relationship with them, where I compliment them on the positive things they do, where I encourage them toward good things, where I share good times, where I share play and meals together with them. And that gives me the background relationship from which to say, son, this thing you did was a bad thing. You made a bad choice. There are consequences for that bad choice, and you will have to endure those now, and I am going to impose them. And he knows when I do that, because of this background relationship, one, he knows he has to do it. But two, he knows that I don't hate him. And that's where I think that's the thing that crosses over. You know, we don't have that kind of authority relationship with most of our neighbors.
No.
But we ought to have that kind of relationship of friendship with them, such that they know that disagreement doesn't mean hatred. And too often today, because we lack those relationships, that's exactly how it comes across. So I guess, you know, all of that is to say, part of our task, part of the church's task right now is to make friends with one another. And then from there to model a life that is appealing and beautiful in some way, that invites people in, and from which we develop the authority and the relationship to say, to copy our master and say, you are welcome here and we love you, and also go and sin no more. Because each of us needs to be told, go and sin no more.
That notion of making friends is not what's being preached from either side, but particularly I would say the conservative even media, even what's on YouTube and other voices of that nature. It's just meant to mock the other side. And I recognize that there's something that needs to be made fun of. Again, I love comedy. I have no problem with that. But it just seems like that isn't a virtue that's being extolled, even from Catholic voices, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah, I do think there are multiple jobs for multiple people,
right.
you know,
Fair enough.
And I do
Fair
think
enough.
there are people who are really well suited without crossing the line to pointing up the problem with something by, in a sense, making fun of it. But most of us are probably better suited to having a small group of friends with whom we have some influence and some sway, whether that's our neighborhood or our town or our parish. And so, you know, the Lord has distributed many talents across the human spectrum. And some people some people are particularly well suited to be the lightning rod, the kid who says the emperor is naked. But then a lot of us need to be there alongside to help those people who now realize that the emperor is naked pick up the pieces of their lives and come back to something healthier and true.
Okay. This is great. So shift gears here for a second. We've been talking about kind of cultural themes and kind of how we've gotten to this point. But another element that I think has contributed to where we are as a society today is just our advancements with regards to technology and science. In that these questions, historically, when we think about like our evolutionary history and what a man was evolved to be able to do and what a woman has been evolved to be able to do, technology in many ways has kind of neutralized those distinctions. I mean, like when we think of factories, for example, I mean, a woman can hit a button to get a robot to do something just as effectively as a man could. So a lot of kind of the need for those kind of physical differences between men and women from a technological standpoint has gone away. I mean, a guy can be on an iPhone just as much as a woman can, and those conversations can happen. So technology has created almost this neutralizing effect. So that's one thought, so just hold that. But then the other piece is that what technology has also done is that specifically when it comes to kind of digital technologies, is that we've created so much to try to reduce the friction or reduce the need for another person, that we can, so much as being automated, I can do things on my own. I mean, this will of course culminate in something like having a robot in our house, which is going to happen in a few years. We'll have some artificial generated general intelligence robot that will be in our house that will be able to take care of everything. It'll do the dishes for us. It'll clean for us. It'll do whatever we want. And it'll be able to be our friend, so to speak, and answer whatever questions that we have. That we're getting to this point where the practical need for one another is is being lost. And because of those practical needs, like we're not hunter-gatherer tribes anymore. We're not even 150 years ago living in towns or communities where somebody was a blacksmith and somebody was a cobbler and somebody was the butcher. Like even those type of kind of local distinctions just don't exist as much as they used to. So the practical kind of needs for one another are evaporating, which is why people are like, well, marriage is obsolete. It's like, well, I guess under these norms, I can understand why you would say that. But then, of course, we look at the research and we say, well, look at the loneliness epidemic, like the general surgeon's warning from last year. I think even recently, he just put one out about social media very, very recently. We're seeing that there are these rise in mental health, poor mental health standards for kids, anxieties through the roof with young kids. Conversations related to sex is like, it's just so happening at such a young age. Things that I'm sure you've seen just even as an educator regard to discipline and kids' behaviors that I don't even know what I'm asking. I'm just trying to pinpoint that like technology has played a major role in this flatlining of the sexual difference. And so how do we convince, I guess this is my question, how do we convince a culture, back to this question of kind of conversation, how do we convince a culture to look even beyond what those technological kind of advances are and say they're good, but we still can't lose these fundamental differences that exist between us, and we do so at our own peril?
Yeah, that's right. So I think back to this, one of Martin Heidegger's most important works is his essay on questions concerning technology. And one of the key points he makes there is that technology is not simply the set of all our tools, right? That might be one way to understand what the word technology actually refers to. It's just like the total sum of all human tools. But that's not the right way to understand it, or not the complete way. That additionally, what technology is a way of seeing the world and interacting with the world. And that way is to see the world as what he calls standing reserve, or raw material to be manipulated for whatever end we choose. It has no natural end. It's just raw material for us to use to do with whatever we want. And technology tends to encourage us to see the world. More technology encourages us to see the world more like that. So a key distinction, that's all really abstract.
Sure.
A key distinction that he gives to help make help us see the difference is the natural way of viewing the world and interacting with the world is encapsulated by a technology called a bridge, right? Which is how we get from one side of the river to the other. But it negotiates with nature to accomplish our end without interfering with nature, without seeing nature as merely raw material to be used, a kind of respect for nature, as well as our own purposes. Now, contrast that with a dam, right, over a river, which sees the river merely as potential power. We can extract power from that river if we dam it up and then use generators to push the water, to turn the generators, and we can make electricity. So the river then just becomes mere raw material for creating power. Having this view of the world is part of our problem today, because we see our own bodies as merely raw material. We've already talked about gender dysphoria. You see that clearly there. We see our relationships in a transactional way as merely raw material 100%. For our own ends. And where this lands us,
often sexual ends with that's the
and even sex itself becomes merely
transactional,
merely for our own. Merely for our own pleasure.
Yeah, that's right. Keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
And so that's all right. The result we see of that is profoundly increasing abstraction, loneliness. So recent data on this, I was a bit surprised by. I expected, in looking at Gallup's data on loneliness, to see our seniors, particularly as people are living longer and longer, and then often losing a spouse, right? So if you live to be 90, most of the people you've ever known will have died.
Right.
And so I thoroughly expected for that to be the loneliest age cohort. I was wrong.
You were wrong.
The loneliest age cohort is 18 to 24. We are raising a generation of people who are isolated, anxious, depressed, because human beings fundamentally are not made to live this way. So what you're pointing us to is that in the past, physical material necessity pulled us toward something that is good for us on other grounds.
That's
right?
it.
These relationships
Yes.
are good for us for a whole host of reasons beyond merely the material satisfaction of needs like food, clothing, and shelter. Now we don't have the easy way. We don't get to play the game in easy mode anymore because we don't have our bellies, our empty bellies telling us we had better team up with other people to grow and hunt food. But rather, now we need something else. So in a way, I feel for my kids because it means that they're going to have to be intentional and thoughtful and purposeful about things that were automatic for us. Let me give you an example of that. One of my previous gigs, I've both taught high school and been a headmaster of a Catholic high school. And in both those capacities, one of the things I learned that kids are struggling with today is friendship. So when I was working with college students even, they would confess that, of course they weren't ready for marriage, in part because lots of people aren't really dating anymore. And I kind of knew that was coming. But what I wasn't expecting was to have 20-year-olds tell me that they didn't have many friends and they weren't sure how to initiate, foster, and grow healthy friendships, deep friendships. And then asking that same question of younger and younger kids, and I began to see how deep this problem really goes. That we are not sure how to make friends anymore. Well, it would never have occurred. I'm Gen X, right? I'm going to be 47 years old next month. So friendship was automatic to me as a kid. It just happened. My parents didn't have to do anything. Nobody had to force it. Nobody had to train us. It happened because of the circumstances that pulled us all together. We didn't really have a lot of video gaming. We didn't. The internet was very new and very slow, right? Exactly. So we weren't lost in there was no social media. We weren't involved in all of that. And so a normal day, a normal summer day like today for me would have been get up, have breakfast, do some early morning chores or jobs around the house that my mom had picked out for us to do. And then we were booted out the door and told, when you get thirsty, there's a hose on the side of the house. Go play. Come back at lunch. And we went and found nobody had cell phones, so we went and knocked on our friends' doors to see if they were up and ready and able to come out and play. And we built friendships, and we learned how to negotiate with other people and negotiate life with other people through play, as human beings have done since time immemorial. And our kids today are not getting this. And so this is an example of what you're talking about. The role technology is a lot of the reason why this is not happening with our kids today.
So Gen X as a cohort growing up all experienced that, but now they're all the parents that are causing these problems. I mean, like, this is a question that my 16-year-old asked. He's like, because we have lots of conversations about the phone, about technology, about putting limits. And I talked to him about the loneliness research, things that we've been speaking about here. And he says, but Dad, like, aren't you guys the reason that we're doing all this? Because like, you're the parents who aren't setting the rules. And I was like, well, fair enough. But I mean, like, it's a good question to be asking. At what point did we lose our mind and stop like enforcing kind of some of these rules?
Yeah. And in part, I don't want to let us off the hook because your son is right. But as the first generation to deal with these things, it's often the case that technologies develop before our mores of responsibility or responsible use develop, right? Those often lag and come behind. And I think now, 20 to 25 years into the internet, into digital conditions, it's dawning on us all that we have a problem because we have not developed sufficient mores, rules, conventions, and norms around these technologies. And so we're not getting the full good out of them because it's having tremendously deleterious effects on the rest of our lives. And so I think your son is right. We are now at, well, the hopeful side of me says maybe we're at an inflection point.
Right.
Maybe what the next decade is going to see is that those of us who are Gen X parents all kind of get together and say, this is not working for humanity. Yeah. We have to do something here.
Well, I guess that's my
question. But you see this, I want to connect this back to one of the other, connecting it back to gender. It's interesting to me that one of the prescriptions when there are patients with gender dysphoria, one of the prescriptions that helps in those cases, one of the interventions that helps is to get them out into nature, to get them off the internet and out of the chat rooms and off the Reddit threads and back out into nature. So go camping, right? Go for a hike, do something strenuous outdoors within your body. It turns out that to reconnect with who we are as physical beings, one of the best ways to do that is to get out into nature.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this points to the problem that you drew our attention to, which is this nature of technology with its abstracting qualities, to pull us out of ourselves, to pull us out of a physical, material, lived existence and into something artificial.
Yes.
And it can be incredibly useful. Hey, look, I'm not a Luddite. I have a smartphone. I love getting things delivered via Amazon.
It's the best.
But I also don't want to lose my kids into the technology.
That's right. I mean, here we are obviously having this conversation on our respective devices. You're in Texas, I'm in North Carolina. So, I mean, and people listening to this, of course, are listening to it through their phones, primarily using Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So I get it that there is absolutely great good, and I would never be one to say that technology it doesn't have its place. I use artificial intelligence for a lot of my editing and the work that I do with regards to social media posts. I mean, it's phenomenal. But we always have to maintain some level of groundedness, and that's the key. If we think that technology, that if we can just live in the multiverse or the what's the metaverse, excuse me, that as if that is the same thing as reality, where we could just plug ourselves into the matrix or put our Apple Vision Pro goggles on and we don't need to go anywhere anymore because we can just see it and experience it however we want. That's the place where it gets bad, when it's disconnected from reality, when it's disconnected from groundedness, from just our experiences of life beyond just the digital interface. And the consequences are what you're speaking about with regards to friendship. Like kids know how to interact socially through text messaging. They know how to send text. They know how to respond. They know what emojis to use. They know how to use shorthand phrases or abbreviations. I mean, my kids don't even speak in real words anymore. It's the first time I saw like never mind, what is it, NVM or those type of things, it's like what does that even mean? I have to think about that. But they just know how to shorthand everything, and I recognize that that's part of their culture. Okay, fair enough. But the limitation is that they don't know how to then interact, as you've been speaking about, actually face to face in person. And so give me the distinctions again when you talked about Heidegger and technology. The bridge uses technology as something connected with nature and respects it. The dam, for example, uses technology as nature as just kind of strictly utilitarian, this kind of power, this force that's there.
So the dam is an instance of a technological mindset. Where we view all of the world, all of creation, as merely raw material to be converted into our uses.
Got it. Which really goes back to just a heightened utilitarianism. I mean, there's nothing immoral about having a dam. Okay, we recognize that. Like, dams provide a lot of energy, but what you're speaking about is just the mindset of what's there and how we kind of globalize that, using that as just kind of like a symbol. Because even in relationships, when people are dating now, I mean, this is why marriage isn't even viewed as a standard. Marriage rates have plummeted. We know all the research that still supports that marriage is the best option for us and for relationships happier, healthier, more satisfying sexual experiences, financially better, stable off. Married couples compared to singles, across the board, this is what we're seeing. But even when you convey that as a message to a generation that is so lost within its phones or even lost within its own nihilism, they say, well, that's what does that mean? You know what I mean? Because all these relationships have become so transactional and utilitarian. It's like, well, we can mutually please each other, or I can just have a friend with benefit. I don't need entanglements. I don't need commitments. Let me focus on my career. Let me not give time towards relationships. That we're finding that this kind of ideology, what we've been speaking about, is trickling down, not just even to friendships, but as having very detrimental effects when it comes to romantic relationships as well. So how do we help that? How do we help people start seeing again that even the value of romance isn't something that's just strictly for orgasm, if I'm going to be crass for a second there?
Sure. Yeah, I do think the problem is very deep, and so the interventions have to start early. And what I mean by that is, in the same way that I was saying earlier, we now have to be thoughtful about things that in the past we didn't have to be thoughtful or intentional about.
Right.
It may mean that we need to teach kids starting in elementary school how to form healthy friendships and start creating the conditions. We may have to be deliberate about creating the conditions of possibility in which they will meet other kids and form those friendships, right? And develop and deepen and grow those friendships, so that we can turn to like phase two of the formation after they have learned how to make friends. Then when puberty comes along, they're ready to start making friends where they have attractions to them, right? So because those of us who are married, where we have a happy marriage, will tell you, if you had better be a very good friend with your spouse, right? Because you're going to need to be a good friend to them, and you're going to want them to be a good friend to you. So friendship skills are not the sum total, right? There's more to a good marriage than friendship, but friendship's a lot of it. And so the first thing we teach kids is how to be good friends. And that's going to strike those of us who are Gen X, that's going to strike our ears as weird, because we never got taught that. We didn't have to be taught that. We drank that in from the culture, right? We were actually taught it. We were just taught it sort of passively and subtly. And now we have to do it intentionally. And that's just one of the features of our age and era, is that we're going to have to be intentional about this. And then when they're teenagers, that sets us up to be intentional about teaching them about romantic relationships and how to do dating well, so that they can then do marriage well. And it's a process. And so it seems strange to our ears. Look, I'm with every one of your listeners who thinks it sounds strange to say that we have to start marriage prep at 5 years old. But in a sense, that's what we have to do, because that's how deep the problem is.
Agreed. Which is why I have all these dating programs. One of them called Dating Well. Thanks for that plug. I appreciate that. You didn't even know that you were calling it that. So I appreciate it. But if we go back to, bringing this conversation back to kind of the comparison of the church's teaching with regards to masculinity and femininity and the modern, or the feminist kind of notions of and teaching related to it. Do you think that those kind of early wave feminists who are arguing against the patriarchy or things of this nature, or more socialist ideas, or whatever it was, the freedoms for women, liberation from the body, those type of things, how do you think they would react to the world that we're living right now? I mean, do you think that they would be like, wow, this is the logical conclusions of kind of what we started? Or do you think they themselves would be kind of appalled or surprised by how far this actually came?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some would and some wouldn't.
Yeah.
So it's important to read Simone de Beauvoir just to just to understand how radical
She was,
she
yeah,
was
well,
on some
mercy.
things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, for example, just so your listeners have a sense of, I'm not creating a straw man
Yeah. Yeah.
out of her. She actually thought women should not have the choice to work at home and as their work
Mm-hmm.
to work in the home.
Mm.
She thought they ought to have to be compelled to put children in childcare and to leave the home and go into the professional world. So this view is so radical, it's not necessarily about even maximizing choice,
Mm-hmm.
which is what we tend to associate
Mm-hmm.
with that kind of view. But no, there was that's how radical the plan
And why? Why did she
was
say
from
that?
some of, because that's what will give them freedom.
That's what will give them freedom.
That the home is actually so it's a very flat notion of human freedom,
Mm-hmm.
a very flat
Mm-hmm.
notion of human flourishing, and even of human variety.
Mm-hmm.
My own experience in life tells me that there are going to be lots of situations where women prefer not to work outside the home at all,
Mm-hmm.
and other situations where women prefer to work part-time, and some situations where women prefer to work full-time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are situations where each of those makes sense, that this is a prudential question for each in their marriage. Now, I will tell you, one of the things the data tells us is that even to this day, and even at the highest levels of education, so women who have PhDs, women who have MDs, they're medical doctors, they have JDs, they're attorneys, the modal, so the most frequently preferred form of work for them is part-time. So this is one of those sex differences that's very stark, that's very persistent, and so has to be put away and not talked about. Right? We have to pretend we don't see that this difference is still there. De Beauvoir would not allow for that sort of distance, that sort of difference. And I think one of the differences that proceeding from the truths of the church makes is that we look at that data and say, okay, we can account for that difference of experience in human life. So I do think, to answer your question then, that some of the early architects would look at where we are and say, keep the hammer down, keep going faster, more. I think there are other figures that you could look to who definitely would not be on board with that. So Wollstonecraft comes to mind, probably would not be on board with that. Even Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique, would probably not be fully on board with some of the things, as we see that we now find strange instances, or seemingly strange instances, where faithful sons and daughters of the church are in league with people we never thought we'd be in league with on these questions regarding gender, right? J.K. Rowling's politics are way to my left.
Pro-feminist abortion advocate, 100%. And I think even Bishop Barron just recently wrote an op-ed for CNN saying, like, as a Catholic bishop, I find myself agreeing more and more with Bill Maher, at least that we're on similar ground on some things, which is crazy because Bill Maher is an atheist and has a documentary called Religulous that is making fun of people who worship in general. But
well, and that is a pretty good indication of how crazy our time is, right? If you feel like you're taking crazy pills, right? It's because our time, of all the timelines available, ours might be the most insane on things like that. So I do think, in a way of answering, I do think at least some of the architects, we are always living out somebody's ideas.
That's a good way of saying that.
There's always somebody's idea being instantiated in cultural forms, in law, in institutions.
Right.
And it behooves us to discover whose life we're living out, right? Whose idea of the good we're living out, because we're always living out somebody's.
Yeah, that's great. Question it. Form your conscience, as the church would always say. And that's a great point to encourage people to be able to say, all right, like, well, what are these ideas? And we don't even know because we're just swimming in them. Like the loneliness thing, for example, or the kids not even know what relationships are. It's not their fault. They're just operating within the culture that they've been raised in. They don't know anything different. They haven't been giving those skills or those capacities. And then maybe some of them wake up one day and say, what the heck is going on? I don't understand. And I think we're going to see that. I really do. I genuinely believe that like we have to come back towards the center here, because we just can't keep operating in this direction that we're in. And that's at least what I hope for, is that before we fall off the cliff, that like we take a look and we say, oh no, we got to pull back a little bit here. Well, Kevin, it's been great having you on the show to talk about these themes. I know that we could probably talk for another hour about all sorts of things related to this. But if people have been listening and they're interested in learning more about you or the work that you're doing, or particularly this program at the University of St. Thomas, what would be the best way for folks to get that information?
Sure. Go online to stthom, stthom.edu/CFC, which is the Center for Faith and Culture. So stthom.edu/CFC, and that'll get you to all our offerings.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And Dr. Kevin Stuart, final question that I ask all my first-time guests, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is the easy answer for me is my kids. I see them developing, and I see the community that our parish school, our church, and the other parents who have gathered around their kids, who are all awake to these problems that we're discussing and are committed to doing something about them as a community. And that gives me hope. We just need to see that iterated 1,000,000 times over.
That's exactly right. See your children, love them, ask the big questions because of it, and it'll guide you. It'll guide you back to the Lord. I think that's Russell Brand's story. That's what led to his kind of spiritual awakening, was the birth of his daughter. He just was blown away by the fact that this other person emerged from his wife's body, and he started asking these deep questions about it, up until even recently just converting to Christianity and being baptized here recently. So our kids are a great source of hope. So wonderful to say that. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining me on the show. Many blessings to you and the work that you guys are doing. Thanks for being a great guest.
I'd be glad to be here.